The red on-air light was glowing when Elvis Presley suddenly stopped talking. Not gradually. Not because Johnny Carson had interrupted him. Elvis simply stopped in the middle of a sentence and stared past Johnny's desk toward the darkness at the edge of the studio. Millions of people were watching. The audience had been laughing only seconds earlier. Now Elvis wasn't smiling. Johnny noticed first. Elvis. No response. Elvis leaned forward. Something near the aisle had caught his attention. A security guard was moving toward a small figure standing beside the audience. Then Elvis saw what the figure was carrying. A battered guitar case. And suddenly Elvis stood. Johnny turned toward the audience. What have we got going on over there? The cameras shifted. The audience twisted in their seats. Standing beside the aisle was a young boy. Maybe 11. Maybe 12. His clothes were worn. His shoes looked too old for him. Both hands were wrapped around the handle of a scratched guitar case, as though letting go of it would mean losing the last important thing he owned. A security guard reached him. The boy immediately stepped backward. Elvis raised his hand. Wait! The guard stopped. Elvis walked toward the edge of the stage. Let him come. Johnny glanced toward the producers. Nobody had planned this. A stage manager shook his head. One cameraman looked toward the control booth. But Elvis wasn't asking permission. He was looking directly at the boy. Come on, son. The child didn't move. Elvis smiled gently. Nobody's gonna hurt you. Slowly, the boy stepped into the aisle. Then another step. Hundreds of people watched him walk toward one of the most famous men alive. When he finally reached the stage, Elvis crouched so they were nearly eye to eye. What's your name? The boy swallowed. Michael. Michael. Elvis smiled. That's quite a guitar case you've got there. Michael looked down. His grip tightened. Johnny walked from behind his desk and stopped several feet away. Elvis nodded toward the case. You play. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the beautiful acoustic guitar Elvis had been holding during the interview. Then he whispered, My dad taught me your songs. Elvis's smile disappeared. Your dad plays. Michael lowered his eyes. He did. 2 words. That was all. But something in the way the boy said them changed Elvis's face. He understood. Elvis spoke more softly. What happened to him? Michael looked toward the floor. He died. The studio became completely silent. Johnny lowered the cards in his hand. Elvis remained crouched. I'm sorry, son. Michael nodded. My dad loved your music. His voice trembled. He used to come home from work and we'd sit in the kitchen after dinner. Elvis listened. He had this old guitar. It wasn't very good. Michael almost smiled. He said good guitars were for rich people and good songs didn't care how much the guitar cost. A few people in the audience smiled. Elvis did too. Sounds like your dad knew something about music. Michael nodded. He taught me chords. How many? Not many. Enough to play. Michael shrugged. Sometimes. Elvis glanced toward the battered case. That his guitar. Michael's expression changed. No. What happened to it? The boy became quiet. Elvis waited. Finally, Michael said, It broke. The story came slowly. After his father's death, Michael had kept the guitar beside his bed. He played it when he missed him. sometimes badly, sometimes for hours. The instrument wasn't valuable. Its finish was worn. The neck had been repaired before. But to Michael, it was priceless. Because when he wrapped his fingers around the same chords his father had taught him, the house didn't feel quite as empty. Then, several weeks earlier, the guitar had been badly damaged. Michael's mother had taken it to a repair shop. The answer had been devastating. Repairing it would cost more than the family could afford. Buying another instrument wasn't possible either. So Michael had stopped playing. Elvis looked at him. "You haven't played since?" Michael shook his head. "I still practice the chords on my knee." That sentence hit Elvis harder than anything else. A child practicing music on an instrument that wasn't there. Johnny looked away. Elvis glanced down at his own guitar. Then back at Michael. "You came here tonight because you wanted a guitar." Michael immediately shook his head. "No, sir." "Then why?" Michael's eyes filled. "I wanted to see you." "Why?" The boy struggled to answer. "Because when I hear you sing." His voice cracked. "I remember Dad." Elvis lowered his head. For several seconds, the cameras captured nothing but silence. Then Michael added, "I thought maybe if I saw you once, I could tell him about it someday." Elvis looked up sharply. Johnny's expression collapsed. Someone in the audience began crying. Elvis reached out and gently placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "Son." He stopped. His voice wasn't ready. "And before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? Tell us your city or country in the comments. And if you believe music can keep the memory of someone we love alive, like this video, comment, share it with someone who needs this story, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories about legendary moments and the people behind them. Because what Elvis was about to do with the guitar in his hands would change this boy's life. But first, Elvis wanted to hear about his father. What was his name? Thomas. What kind of man was Thomas? Michael looked surprised. Nobody had asked that. He worked a lot. Elvis nodded. What else? He was funny. Michael smiled through tears. He sang terribly. The audience laughed softly. Elvis smiled. Most dads do. Michael continued. He always said he was gonna learn to sing like you. What happened? He never got any better. Even Johnny laughed. The sadness in the studio softened. Then Elvis asked, what was his favorite song? Michael froze. He looked at Elvis's guitar, then whispered the title. Elvis's expression changed immediately. He knew exactly what the boy was asking without Michael having to ask. Elvis looked toward the orchestra. The bandleader began to move. Elvis raised one hand. No band. Johnny stared at him. Elvis walked back toward his chair. He picked up the acoustic guitar. Then, instead of returning to his seat, he brought another chair toward Michael. Sit down. Michael obeyed. Elvis sat beside him. No orchestra. No backing singers. No introduction. Just one guitar. One grieving child. And Elvis Presley. Elvis adjusted the instrument. Then looked at Michael. This the one? Michael nodded. Elvis's fingers settled against the strings. The first chord rang through the studio. Perfectly clean. Michael's eyes immediately filled with tears. Elvis began singing. Softly, almost as if 50 million people weren't listening. He wasn't performing for the cameras anymore. He was singing for one boy. Michael lowered his head. The second verse came. His shoulders began trembling. Elvis noticed. His voice softened even further. Michael covered his mouth. A tear fell onto his hand. Johnny Carson was no longer looking at his notes. Several audience members were openly crying. And Elvis kept singing. Until halfway through the song, his own voice nearly broke. He stopped for half a heartbeat. Michael looked up. Their eyes met. Elvis continued. The final verse came quietly. Then the last chord. Elvis let it ring. And when it disappeared, nobody applauded. Not because they weren't moved. Because applause somehow felt too loud. Michael wiped his face. Thank you. Elvis looked at him. You're welcome, son. Then Elvis looked down at the guitar. His thumb slowly moved across the polished wood. He had played that instrument before. Held it beneath other lights. Made memories with it. Michael stood. I should go. Elvis didn't answer. Johnny looked toward him. Elvis. Still nothing. Elvis reached behind his shoulder. His fingers found the strap. Then he slowly pulled it over his head. Michael stopped. Elvis stood with the guitar in both hands. The audience sensed something was happening. Johnny's eyes widened. A producer stepped closer to the stage. Elvis walked directly toward Michael. Then knelt. He held the guitar out. Michael stared at it. He didn't understand. Elvis moved it closer. Take it. Michael's mouth opened. What? This belongs to you now. The boy stepped backward. No, sir. Elvis smiled. Michael shook his head harder. No, that's your guitar. Elvis looked down at the instrument. Then back at the child. A guitar's supposed to make memories. He paused. I've already made mine with this one. Michael's eyes filled again. Elvis pushed the instrument gently toward him. Now you make yours. The audience exploded. People stood. Johnny covered his mouth. Michael stared at the guitar as though Elvis were handing him something impossible. Finally, his trembling hands wrapped around it. He pulled it against his chest. Then suddenly, Michael began crying uncontrollably. Elvis embraced him. The applause became thunder. But as Elvis pulled away, Michael looked down at the guitar. Then back at Elvis. Mr. Presley. Yes, son. Michael wiped his face. There was something different in his expression now. Fear, hope, and a question he wasn't certain he had the courage to ask. Can I play something for you? The audience instantly became silent. Elvis stared at him. Then smiled. He pulled his chair directly in front of the boy. Sat down. And said, Michael, I'd be honored. The boy slowly placed Elvis Presley's guitar across his knees. His fingers found the strings. They were trembling badly. He attempted the first chord. Missed. Michael froze. Someone in the audience shifted. Elvis leaned forward. Don't look at them. Michael looked up. Elvis pointed gently toward himself. Play it for me. Michael swallowed. He tried again. This time the chord rang clearly. And when Elvis heard which song the boy had chosen, the smile slowly disappeared from his face. Because it was the song Michael's father had taught him. But nobody in that studio knew yet that before Michael reached the final verse, he was going to change one line and those few words would bring Elvis Presley to tears on live television. Michael's fingers trembled against Elvis Presley's guitar. The entire television studio had disappeared into silence. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk without touching his notes. The orchestra remained motionless. Hundreds of audience members leaned forward, and millions more were watching from home. But Elvis had already told Michael the only thing that mattered. "Don't look at them." Michael raised his eyes. Elvis pointed toward himself. "Play it for me." Michael swallowed. Then he tried the chord again. This time it rang cleanly through the studio. Elvis smiled. "There you go." Michael's shoulders relaxed slightly. His fingers moved toward the next chord. It wasn't perfect. One string buzzed. Another note arrived a fraction too late. But Elvis didn't react. He simply listened. Michael began singing. His voice was small. Nothing like the powerful voice audiences expected from the man sitting in front of him. But there was something inside it that technique couldn't teach. Memory. The first verse carried Michael back to a kitchen table where his father had once sat across from him with an old guitar. A tired man coming home from work. A boy trying desperately to position his fingers correctly. A father laughing whenever the chord sounded terrible. Again, Thomas would tell him. Michael would complain. His fingers hurt. Thomas would smile. "Then you're learning." Now those same fingers were wrapped around Elvis Presley's guitar. Michael missed another chord. He stopped. "Sorry." Elvis immediately shook his head. "For what?" "I messed it up." Elvis leaned closer. "Did your dad ever miss chords?" Michael almost laughed. "All the time." "Then you're doing it right." The audience laughed softly. Michael smiled and continued. The second verse was stronger. His voice still trembled, but he wasn't looking at the audience anymore. He was looking at Elvis. And Elvis was listening as though nothing else existed. Johnny watched the transformation. Minutes earlier, Michael had barely been able to speak. Now the boy was sitting beneath television lights with one of the most recognizable guitars in America across his knees. And for the first time since walking onto the stage, he didn't look afraid. He looked like a musician. Elvis noticed it too. Michael's left hand moved between the chords his father had taught him. Then came the final verse. Elvis knew the song. He knew what Michael was supposed to sing next. But Michael hesitated. His fingers continued playing. His mouth opened. Then he changed the words. Not dramatically, not cleverly. He simply sang what was inside him. His voice cracked as he sang about how his father might be gone. But every time his hands touched the strings, he could still feel his father beside him. Elvis stopped breathing for a moment. Michael continued. He sang about remembering the kitchen, the lessons, the laughter, the man who had taught him that music didn't need to be perfect to mean something. Elvis lowered his head. His eyes filled. Johnny slowly turned away from the camera. A woman in the front row pressed a handkerchief against her face. Another audience member held the person beside her. Michael reached the last chord. His fingers shook. The note rang, then faded. Silence. Michael looked at Elvis. Was that okay? Elvis didn't answer. Michael's expression fell. Mr. Presley. Elvis wiped beneath one eye, then looked up. Son, don't ever ask somebody if a song like that was okay. Michael stared at him. Elvis stood and walked toward the boy. If you meant it. He touched his chest. Then it was enough. Michael's eyes filled again. Elvis pulled him into his arms. And the studio erupted. This time, the applause wasn't for Elvis. He knew it. Johnny knew it. Michael probably didn't. He stood clutching the guitar while hundreds of strangers rose for him. He looked terrified again. Elvis leaned toward his ear. Look. Michael slowly turned. People were standing, clapping, crying. A cameraman behind one of the huge television cameras wiped his eye. Even members of the orchestra were applauding. Michael looked back at Elvis. Why are they standing? Elvis smiled. Because you made them feel something. But I made mistakes. So, Michael looked confused. Elvis crouched. Listen to me. The applause slowly faded. There's always gonna be somebody who plays faster. Somebody who sings higher. Somebody with a more expensive instrument. Elvis pointed toward Michael's chest. But nobody else gets to be you. Michael stared at him. And nobody else had your father. Michael's eyes immediately filled again. So don't spend your whole life trying to sound like Elvis Presley. The audience became quiet. Elvis smiled. Figure out what Michael sounds like. Johnny lowered his head. That line hit differently. Because Elvis wasn't creating a fan. He was trying to create a musician. Johnny finally walked toward them. Well, his voice sounded rough. He cleared his throat. I had jokes prepared. The audience laughed. Johnny looked toward Michael. I don't think I can use any of them now. Michael smiled. Johnny turned toward Elvis. Do you understand what you just gave him? Elvis glanced toward the guitar. Yeah. Johnny raised an eyebrow. You're sure? Elvis smiled. Johnny, you're asking that question like you're my accountant. The audience laughed. Johnny shook his head. I'm serious. So am I. Elvis looked at Michael. A guitar isn't doing much good sitting in a case because somebody thinks it's important. Then he pointed toward the instrument. It's important when somebody plays it. Michael looked down at the polished wood. I'll take care of it. Elvis's expression changed. No. Michael looked up. No. Scratch it. The boy stared at him. Johnny laughed. Elvis continued. Wear it out. Play it until your fingers hurt. Take it places. Write something terrible on it. Michael smiled. Terrible. Your first song probably will be. The audience laughed. Elvis grinned. Mine weren't all masterpieces either. Then his expression softened. Don't preserve my guitar, son. He placed his hand on Michael's shoulder. Use it to build your own memories. Johnny looked toward the control booth. They were running far beyond the planned segment. A producer signaled urgently. Johnny ignored him. Elvis noticed. How much time? Johnny looked toward the clock. Not enough. Elvis smiled. Then we'll steal some. More laughter. But Michael suddenly became serious. Mr. Presley. Yes. What if I'm not good enough? The question stopped Elvis. Michael continued. My dad thought I could play. He looked down. But what if he was only saying that because he was my dad? Elvis slowly sat beside him. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, your father probably believed something before you did. Michael looked at him. That doesn't mean you're guaranteed to become famous. Michael listened. It doesn't mean you're going to sell records. It doesn't even mean music has to become your job. Elvis pointed toward the guitar. But if playing that makes you feel close to your father. He paused. Then you're already good enough for a reason that matters. Michael's lower lip trembled. Elvis continued. Fame isn't the test. Money isn't the test. Applause sure isn't the test. He looked around the studio. Sometimes the test is whether you still play when nobody's clapping. The room became completely silent. Then Elvis stood. He turned toward Johnny. I need another microphone. Johnny blinked. For what? Elvis held out his hand. Just trust me. Johnny glanced toward the producers, then took a spare microphone from the desk and handed it to him. Elvis walked toward the front of the stage. Michael watched. The audience quieted. Elvis looked toward the main television camera. For the first time since Michael had arrived, Elvis wasn't speaking only to the boy. He was speaking to millions. Folks. His voice was calm. This young man came here tonight carrying something heavier than that guitar case. Michael lowered his eyes. Elvis continued. He lost his father, and I can't fix that. The studio became silent. Nobody can. Elvis turned toward Michael. But maybe we can make sure losing somebody doesn't mean losing everything they put inside you. Michael stared at him. Elvis looked toward Johnny. I want this boy to have lessons. Michael's eyes widened. Elvis continued. Proper lessons. He pointed toward the guitar. And we're going to find him another instrument for practicing. Michael stood. Another one. Elvis nodded. That one stays yours. But. No buts. The audience laughed. Then Elvis said, and I'd like somebody from my people to talk to his mother. Michael froze. Why? Elvis looked at him. Because instruments and lessons cost money. Michael shook his head. My mom won't take money. Elvis smiled. Good. Michael looked confused. Elvis continued. I'm not offering charity. He walked closer. I'm investing in a musician. The audience erupted. Michael covered his face. Elvis waited until he looked up again. You willing to work? Michael nodded violently. Yes, sir. You willing to practice when you'd rather be outside? Yes, sir. You willing to keep going when you sound terrible? Michael laughed through his tears. Yes, sir. Elvis extended his hand. Then we've got a deal. Michael shook it. But Elvis still held the second microphone. Johnny noticed. You said you needed that for something. Elvis looked down at it. Then toward the camera. His expression became serious. Yeah. The applause disappeared. Elvis stepped beneath the brightest studio light. People have a funny idea about being blessed. He paused. They think it means having more than everybody else. More money. More success. More things. Elvis glanced toward Michael, holding his former guitar. Then looked back into the camera. Maybe being blessed means having enough to give something away. Nobody moved. Michael stared at him. Elvis continued. Because someday, none of us are taking our guitars with us. A few people smiled through tears. We are not taking the records. We're not taking the houses. And we're definitely not taking the applause. Elvis looked toward Michael. But maybe somebody remembers what we gave them. Johnny's eyes filled. The studio remained completely silent. Then Michael walked toward Elvis. He didn't say anything. He simply wrapped his arms around him. Elvis hugged him back. The audience rose again. And for several seconds, the cameras captured nothing but a superstar holding a grieving child beneath the studio lights. Eventually, Michael whispered, "Thank you." Elvis answered quietly, "Don't thank me yet." Michael pulled away. "Why?" Elvis smiled. "Because now you've got homework." Michael laughed. "What homework?" Elvis pointed toward the guitar. "Keep playing." The segment eventually ended. The red light went dark. But Michael didn't leave immediately. Elvis introduced him to one of his people. Names were exchanged. Arrangements began. Johnny returned to his desk. The audience slowly settled. Everything seemed finished. Then, just before Michael walked backstage, he turned around. "Elvis." Elvis looked toward him. Michael held the guitar against his chest. "I promise." Elvis frowned. "Promise what?" Michael smiled. "I won't stop." Elvis nodded. "That's all I wanted to hear." Michael disappeared behind the curtain. Elvis watched the empty doorway for several seconds. Then Johnny approached. "You think he'll keep that promise?" Elvis looked toward where the boy had vanished. "I hope so." Johnny nodded. The show continued. The cameras eventually stopped. The audience went home. And for a while, Michael disappeared from Elvis Presley's world. Weeks passed. Then months. No cameras followed the boy. No audience applauded when he practiced. Nobody knew whether the guitar remained in its case, or whether Michael had kept his promise. Until one afternoon, months later, an envelope arrived at the television studio. Johnny Carson's name was written across the front. Inside was a photograph, a letter, and a message written in a child's handwriting. Johnny read the first line, then stopped. He immediately looked toward his producer. "Find out when Elvis is coming back." Because Michael had kept his promise. But what he had done with Elvis's guitar since that night was about to make the story even more emotional than anyone imagined. Months had passed since Michael walked off that television stage carrying Elvis Presley's guitar. The studio had moved on. New guests had occupied the chair. New jokes had filled the room. New celebrities had walked beneath the lights. But one afternoon, Johnny Carson sat behind his desk long after rehearsal and stared at a photograph that had arrived inside a plain envelope. It showed Michael. The boy looked different. Not dramatically older, but happier, more confident. And across his lap rested the guitar Elvis had placed in his hands months earlier. The polished wood wasn't quite as polished anymore. There were fingerprints across the body, a tiny scratch near the edge. Johnny smiled when he noticed it. Elvis had told him, "Don't preserve my guitar, play it." Michael had listened. Johnny unfolded the letter again. Most of it had been written by Michael's mother. But at the bottom were several uneven handwritten words from the boy himself. Johnny read them twice, then a third time. "Mr. Elvis, I kept playing. Mom says Dad would be proud." Johnny lowered the paper. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked toward the producer. When is Elvis coming back? The producer checked the schedule. Soon. Johnny folded the letter carefully. Good. Should we send it to him? Johnny looked again at the photograph. No. He placed it inside his desk. I want to give it to him here. When Elvis returned to the studio, he knew nothing. He walked onto the familiar set beneath thunderous applause, smiling and waving toward the audience. Johnny greeted him. The interview began normally. They joked. They talked about touring, music, life on the road. Johnny even teased Elvis about giving away possessions faster than the people around him could keep track of them. Elvis laughed. I've still got my shoes. Johnny looked underneath the desk. For now. The audience erupted. Then Johnny's expression changed. He reached beneath the desk. Elvis noticed immediately. What have you got? Johnny didn't answer. He removed a plain envelope. Elvis's smile weakened. You remember a young boy who came onto this stage? Elvis became still. Michael. Johnny nodded. The audience reacted. Some remembered instantly. Elvis leaned forward. Is he okay? There was genuine concern in his voice. Johnny smiled. He's okay. Elvis exhaled. Don't scare me like that, Johnny. Soft laughter moved through the studio. Johnny removed the photograph. He sent something. Elvis reached for it, then froze. There was Michael, sitting with the guitar. Elvis stared. A smile slowly appeared across his face. He played it. Johnny nodded. He definitely played it. Elvis noticed the scratch. He pointed. Look at that. Johnny smiled. I thought you'd be upset. Upset? Elvis laughed. That's the best part. He held the photograph closer. Means the boy's using it. Then Johnny handed him the letter. There's something at the bottom for you. Elvis looked down. His eyes moved across the handwriting, and then stopped. The smile disappeared. The audience became quiet. Elvis read the words again. Mr. Elvis, I kept playing. Mom says Dad would be proud. His jaw tightened. He lowered his head. Johnny said nothing. The camera slowly moved closer. Elvis rubbed beneath one eye. He tried to smile. It didn't quite work. That boy. His voice failed. The studio became completely silent. Elvis looked again at the photograph, then whispered. He kept his promise. Johnny leaned forward. His mother wrote the rest. Elvis looked up. What did she say? Johnny unfolded another page. She said the lessons started. Elvis nodded. She said at first Michael almost quit. Elvis's expression changed. Why? His fingers hurt. He became frustrated. He kept comparing himself to other kids. Elvis smiled faintly. Sounds like a musician. Johnny continued. Then she reminded him what you told him. Elvis frowned. What I tell him? Johnny looked directly at him. Don't try to sound like Elvis Presley. Find out what Michael sounds like. Elvis lowered his eyes. Johnny continued. His mother says he went back into his room, picked up that guitar, and practiced until dinner. Elvis smiled. Then Johnny revealed something else. Michael had started playing for his mother. Every evening. The same way his father had once played for him. Sometimes he practiced scales. Sometimes the songs were rough. Sometimes he invented melodies that went nowhere. But one song kept returning. The song Thomas had taught his son before he died. The same song Michael had performed on television. Johnny paused, and his mother says something happened. Elvis waited. What? She stopped crying whenever he played it. Elvis became motionless. Johnny's voice softened. She said for months, hearing anything connected to her husband hurt. But when Michael played, Johnny looked toward the letter. She started remembering the good years instead of only remembering the day she lost him. Elvis closed his eyes. That was the part nobody had predicted. The guitar wasn't only helping Michael. It was helping a family learn how to remember without being destroyed by the memory. Johnny placed the letter on his desk. Elvis, can I ask you something? Sure. When you handed Michael that guitar, did you imagine any of this? Elvis shook his head immediately. No. Then why give it away? Elvis looked toward the audience. For once, there was no quick answer. Finally, he said, because he needed it more than I did. Johnny nodded. But it was valuable. Elvis looked at him. So, the audience became silent. Johnny continued. People would pay a lot for something you played. Elvis leaned back. That's exactly why I don't understand the question. Johnny raised an eyebrow. Elvis pointed toward the photograph. If that guitar sits behind glass someday, somebody can say Elvis Presley touched it. He paused. But if that boy plays it for the next 30 years, he can say his father is still part of every song. Nobody applauded. Not yet. The thought was too heavy. Elvis looked again at Michael's photograph. Which one's worth more? Johnny had no answer. Then Elvis noticed something written beneath the photograph. A few words. He brought it closer. What does this say? Johnny smiled. Read it. Elvis did. Michael had written, one day I want to play a song for somebody who needs it like I did. Elvis stared at the sentence, and suddenly his entire expression changed. Johnny saw it. What? Elvis shook his head. Nothing. But his eyes were wet again. Johnny leaned closer. Elvis. Elvis tapped the photograph gently. That's how you know the gift worked. What do you mean? He doesn't want to keep it for himself. Elvis looked toward the audience. He wants to pass the feeling along. Now the applause began. Slowly, then louder. Elvis lowered his head. After the broadcast, Johnny found Elvis alone near the edge of the empty stage. The audience had left. Most of the lights were dark. Michael's photograph remained in Elvis's hand. Johnny approached. You taking that? Elvis nodded. If that's all right. It's yours. Elvis studied the boy's face. Johnny sat beside him. You changed his life. Elvis shook his head. No. Johnny frowned. Elvis. His father changed his life. Elvis pointed toward the guitar in the photograph. I just gave him something to keep the conversation going. Johnny stared at him. Then Elvis said something quieter. That's what music does sometimes. What? It lets you talk to people who aren't there anymore. Johnny looked toward the empty studio. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Elvis stood. He placed the photograph carefully inside his jacket. And as he began walking away, Johnny called after him. Elvis. Elvis turned. You think he'll still have that guitar when he's grown? Elvis smiled. I hope not. Johnny looked confused. What? Elvis laughed. I hope he wears the thing out. Then he disappeared backstage. Years would begin passing. The television moment would become an old story. The studio would change. Audiences would change. Michael would grow. And the guitar would grow older with him. Its edges would become worn. Tiny scratches would multiply. The strings would be replaced again and again. But it would never become a museum piece. Because Michael remembered Elvis's instruction. Use it. And he did. He played when he missed his father. He played when he was happy. He played when nobody listened. He played when life became difficult. And every new mark on that guitar became proof that the gift hadn't been frozen in the past. It was still living. But years later, someone would see that worn guitar and ask Michael the question Elvis himself had once been asked. Do you understand how much that thing is worth? Michael would look down at the instrument. He would think about his father, about the television studio, about Elvis sitting on the floor and listening to a frightened boy miss chords without laughing. Then Michael would give an answer nobody expected. Because by then, he finally understood something Elvis had been trying to teach him from the beginning. The guitar's greatest value had absolutely nothing to do with Elvis Presley's name. And in the final chapter, Michael would prove it in a way that brought the story full circle. Years passed. The frightened boy who had once walked onto Johnny Carson's stage clutching a battered guitar case was no longer a child. Michael grew taller. His voice changed. His hands became stronger. But one thing remained beside him through almost everything. Elvis Presley's guitar. Except it didn't look like Elvis Presley's guitar anymore. The flawless finish was gone. There were scratches across the body. The edges had faded where Michael's arm rested against the wood. The strings had been replaced countless times. There was a small dent near the bottom from the night Michael accidentally knocked it against a chair. A collector might have looked at those marks and seen damage. Michael saw something completely different. Life. He had obeyed Elvis. He hadn't locked the guitar behind glass. He had played it. He played when he missed his father. He played when his mother sat quietly in the kitchen. He played when school became difficult. He played when nobody cared. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The boy who had once practiced chords against his knee became a musician. Not famous, not surrounded by screaming crowds, but good. More importantly, he became himself. One evening, years after that unforgettable television appearance, Michael was playing at a small community event. There were no television cameras, no enormous audience, no Johnny Carson, no Elvis Presley sitting nearby. Just folding chairs, ordinary families and children gathered around a modest stage. After Michael finished, an older man approached him. His eyes immediately went toward the guitar. He stared, then stared again. "Excuse me." Michael smiled. "Yes." The man pointed. "Is that what I think it is?" Michael looked down. "Depends what you think it is." The man stepped closer. That guitar belonged to Elvis Presley. Several nearby people turned. Michael nodded. "A long time ago." The man's eyes widened. "You actually play it?" Michael laughed. "That's what guitars are for." The man looked horrified. "Do you understand how valuable that could be?" Michael became quiet. He had heard the question before. Collectors had contacted his family. People had offered money, serious money, enough that his mother once asked whether perhaps selling it would be sensible. Michael had always refused, but not because he wanted Elvis memorabilia. He looked at the man. Yeah. The man waited. Michael ran his fingers across one of the scratches. But I don't think you and I mean the same thing when we say valuable. The man frowned. Michael smiled politely and walked away. Because by then, he finally understood what Elvis had given him. It had never been about owning something touched by a superstar. It was about what happened when someone believed in you at precisely the moment you were beginning to stop believing in yourself. Later that evening, Michael noticed a boy sitting alone near the back of the room. He couldn't have been much older than Michael had been that night on television. The child had watched every song, but unlike the others, he hadn't approached afterward. Michael walked toward him. "You play." The boy shook his head. "Want to?" A shrug. Michael recognized that answer. It meant yes, but it also meant, "I'm afraid I'll be terrible." Michael sat beside him. "What's your name?" "David." "Ever held a guitar?" "No." Michael looked down at the instrument in his hands. For a moment, he remembered everything. The NBC studio. The lights. Johnny Carson. His trembling fingers. The first chord he'd missed. And Elvis sitting directly in front of him. "Don't look at them, play it for me." Michael smiled. Then he placed the guitar carefully across David's knees. The boy's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "Teaching you a chord." David immediately pulled his hands away. "I'll break it." Michael laughed. "You won't." "But somebody said that's Elvis Presley's guitar." Michael paused, then answered, "Tonight it's yours for 5 minutes." The boy stared at him. Michael positioned his fingers. "Put this one here." David tried. The chord buzzed horribly. He looked embarrassed. "Sorry." Michael froze. He had said exactly the same thing. Years earlier. On television. To Elvis Presley. Michael smiled. "For what?" David looked confused. "I messed it up." Michael felt something tighten inside his chest. He could almost hear Elvis's voice. So he gave the boy the same patience someone had once given him. "Try again." David did. Another terrible sound. Michael laughed gently. "Again." The third attempt was better. The fourth almost sounded right. Then the fifth rang clearly. David's face changed. That expression. Michael knew it. The moment a child discovers that something impossible might simply be something he hasn't learned yet. "There." Michael smiled. "You heard that." David nodded enthusiastically. "I did it." "You did." The boy immediately tried again. Michael sat beside him and watched. And suddenly, he understood the handwritten message he had sent Elvis years earlier. "One day I want to play a song for somebody who needs it like I did." He had thought he meant performing. He hadn't. This was what he'd meant. Passing something forward. Not the guitar. The belief. That was Elvis's real gift. Michael had carried it for years without fully understanding it. Elvis hadn't simply placed an instrument in his hands. He had shown a grieving boy how powerful it could be when someone took your dreams seriously. Now Michael could do the same. When David finally handed the guitar back, he couldn't stop smiling. "Do you think I could learn?" Michael looked directly at him. Absolutely. How do you know? Michael thought about Elvis, then answered, because somebody once believed it about me before I believed it myself. That night, Michael returned home. His mother was older now. A photograph of his father still stood on a shelf. Michael placed the guitar beside it. His mother looked at the instrument. You taught another child today. Michael smiled. One chord. She laughed. Your father would have liked that. Michael looked toward Thomas's photograph. For years, those words had hurt. Now they felt warm. Mom. Yes. Do you remember when you said Dad would be proud? Of course. Michael looked at the guitar. I think I finally understand why. His mother waited. Not because I kept playing. Michael touched the worn wood. Because I finally helped somebody else start. His mother's eyes filled. She walked toward him and placed a hand against his cheek. He would be proud. Michael lowered his head. This time, he believed her. Years earlier, Elvis Presley had looked into a television camera and said something millions remembered. Being blessed might not mean having more than everyone else. Maybe it meant having enough to give something away. But there was something even Elvis couldn't have known that night. A real gift doesn't always end with the person who receives it. Sometimes it moves. One person gives someone hope. That person grows up. Then one day, he recognizes the same fear in somebody else's eyes and gives that hope again. That's how a single act survives longer than the person who started it. Michael never turned the guitar into a museum piece. He never sealed it inside a glass case. He never treated every scratch like a tragedy. He played it. And eventually, the guitar looked exactly the way Elvis had hoped it would. Used. The wood faded. The finish wore thin. The neck carried the marks of thousands of hours of practice. And every imperfection told a story. One scratch belonged to Michael's childhood. Another came from his first performance after the television appearance. Another from practicing late at night. Another from teaching someone else. Collectors might have looked at the guitar and imagined what it could have been worth if Michael had protected it perfectly. But Michael knew better. Because preserving an object and honoring a gift aren't always the same thing. Elvis hadn't told him, keep this safe. He had told him, make memories. So Michael did. And perhaps the most powerful memory remained the first. A terrified boy. A silent television studio. A guitar placed into trembling hands. And one of the most famous entertainers in the world sitting on the floor beside him as though there was nowhere else he needed to be. Michael had missed chords that night. His voice had cracked. His performance had been imperfect. But Elvis never laughed. Never corrected him for the cameras. Never tried to take the spotlight back. He listened. Because for those few minutes, Elvis Presley understood something that fame can sometimes make people forget. When somebody gives you their dream, even for a moment, you hold it carefully. The greatest gift Elvis gave Michael wasn't made of wood. It wasn't the strings. It wasn't the famous name attached to the instrument. And it wasn't even the money that guitar might someday have been worth. It was hope. Hope that grief didn't have to mean the end of music. Hope that his father's memory could live inside something beautiful instead of only something painful. Hope that a frightened child might actually have something worth hearing. And years later, every new scratch on that guitar proved Michael had kept the promise he made before leaving the studio. I won't stop. He didn't. He kept playing. He kept remembering. And eventually, he gave someone else a reason to begin. Because sometimes a legend isn't remembered for the things he collected. Not the houses, not the records, not the awards, not even the instruments. Sometimes a legend is remembered for the moment he looked at something valuable in his own hands, saw someone who needed it more, and simply said, "This belongs to you now."